The rifle shot cracked through the afternoon air. A man lay bleeding in the dirt. His horse stood riderless, and an entire town just watched. "That's Caleb Rowe," the blacksmith said. "You best stay out of it, ma'am." They said he was a murderer. They said he sabotaged a mine and killed 23 good men. But Eleanor Hale had spent 3 years as a war nurse. She'd held dying boys in her arms while doctors walked away because they wore the wrong uniform. She swore she would never watch another man die just because others decided he wasn't worth saving. So she ran. She pressed her cloak against his wound. And she made a choice that would make her an enemy of the most powerful man in Silver Ridge. Victor Langford owned everything: the mines, the water, the sheriff, even the school board that just hired her. And he had one rule: anyone who helps Caleb Rowe pays the price. But here's the thing about Eleanor: she didn't come west to find trouble. She came to escape her nightmares. She just never learned how to look away. Standing up for what's right when everyone else is sitting down is lonely work. But it only takes one person with courage to remind a whole town what they forgot. This story proves that fear is a choice, and so is courage. When powerful people depend on your silence, your voice becomes the most dangerous weapon of all. If you've ever had to stand alone for something you believed in, drop a comment and tell me your story. And if you want more tales about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, hit subscribe and ring that bell. Your support means everything. Eleanor had just arrived, hoping to leave her own ghosts behind. She was a school teacher now, not the war nurse who still heard the cannons echo in her nightmares. The crack of a rifle shot ripped through the quiet afternoon. Eleanor's blood ran cold. She saw the riderless horse and the man lying on the ground. She turned to the blacksmith standing nearby. "Someone's been shot," she said, her voice tight. "We have to help." The man just shook his head. "That's Caleb Rowe. You best stay out of it, ma'am." But Eleanor couldn't turn her back. She ran across the open ground, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was a healer, and that man needed her help. She knelt beside him in the dirt. There was so much blood. He was barely conscious, but his eyes, gray as a stormy sky, flickered open. "You should go," he whispered, his voice rough. "They'll cause you trouble for this." Eleanor ignored him, her hands already working to find the source of the bleeding. "I'm not asking for your permission," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "Who are you?" he managed to ask. "The new school teacher," she replied, pressing her cloak hard against the wound. He let out a dry, bitter laugh. "I was a nurse during the war," she added. That stopped his laugh cold. He stared at her, a flicker of something like surprise in his tired eyes. "My place is 5 miles north," he said, each word an effort. 5 miles. It seemed an impossible distance, but Eleanor's resolve was like steel. "Then we better get moving," she said, looking back at the silent, watching town. "I don't care what they say you've done. Right now you're hurt, and I know how to help. Everything else is just noise." With a slow nod, he let her take his weight, and together they began their stand against Silver Ridge. It was a dead-still quiet, except for the awful sound of a man fighting for every breath. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She grabbed the reins of the big buckskin horse, talking low and steady. "Easy now, boy." Caleb, bleeding in the dust, managed to whisper, "His name's Dakota. He'll stand for you." Eleanor got under Caleb's arm, ready to lift him. "On 3, she said, her voice firm. 1, 2, 3. He got into that saddle on pure cussedness, but she saw the price in his gray face and shaken hands. As she pressed her cloak to the wound, a well-dressed man with eyes as cold as a blue norther stepped right in her path. "Miss Hale," he said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "I am Victor Langford. You need to leave that man be." Eleanor never stopped walking. "Unless you're a doctor, Mr. Langford, we got nothing to talk about." He matched her stride. "That man is dangerous." She cut him off sharp. "Right now that man is bleeding. Mr. Langford, I spent 3 long years watching boys die because folks thought rules mattered more than kindness. I won't watch another one bleed out for town gossip. Now you can either move, or you can explain to the school board why their new teacher was late." For a second, she thought he might just grab her. Instead, he stepped aside with a smile that never touched his eyes. "We will talk later, Miss Hale." She led the horse past him, the whispers of the townfolk following her like a chill wind. She could feel Caleb swaying, his grip getting weaker. "Stay with me, Caleb," she whispered, her voice tight. "Just 5 miles. You can make it 5 miles." They left the town behind, and she started talking to keep him conscious. She told him stories about back east, about her mother's rose garden, careful to leave out the nightmares that brought her out west. After a while, he started talking too, his voice just a rasp. "This ranch, been in my family since '52, he said. "My folks, they're gone now. Fever took 'em in the winter of '71. He coughed, and she saw fresh blood on her cloak. "Why'd you help me?" he asked, the question hanging in the quiet air. Eleanor didn't have to think on it. "Because nobody else was going to," she said simply, "and I've seen too many men die who didn't have to." The sun was sinking low, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Her arms ached from holding him steady, but then he spoke, his voice barely there. "See 'em? The cottonwoods?" Up ahead, a line of trees marked a bend in the creek, and beyond them she could just make out a house and a barn. "I see it," she said, relief washing over her. "We're almost there." He slumped forward. "Listen," he breathed. "If I don't, you find Mary Chen at the boarding house. After this, you're going to need a friend here." Before she could argue, they were there. A young fella, maybe 17 years old, and the spittin' image of Caleb came running from the barn. "Caleb!" he cried out, his face pale with fear. "He's been shot," Eleanor said, all business. "Help me get him inside. Now!" "Who in the world are you?" The woman replied, "Eleanor Hale, the new school teacher. And you are Jamie Rowe. Caleb is my brother." Together, they managed to get the wounded man, Caleb, into the house and onto a bed. The place smelled of leather and pine. Eleanor took charge immediately, her voice steady. "Get me clean water and that medical kit, and be quick about it." As Jamie hurried off, she cut away the ruined, blood-soaked shirt. The bullet had passed clean through, but he was bleeding badly, and shock was setting in. Jamie returned with the supplies. "Is he going to make it?" the boy asked, his voice trembling. Eleanor looked at him, her hands already working to clean the wound. "Not if I have anything to say about it. Now hold that lamp closer." She stitched the wounds with practiced ease, her movements quick and sure. Caleb's eyes fluttered open for just a moment. "Eleanor," he whispered. "I am right here," she told him. "Now be still." When she finally finished, her hands began to shake. "Are you all right, Miss Hale?" Jamie asked, noticing her tremor. "Just tired," she said, standing up. "He needs to stay quiet, and you must keep those bandages clean." "I know how," Jamie said softly. "My mother was a healer." Outside, the sun had set, and the first stars were appearing. "I suppose I should head back to town," Eleanor said, dreading the 5-mile walk. "You cannot go back in the dark," Jamie insisted. "Besides, Victor Langford is going to have a bone to pick with you for helping Caleb. He basically owns this town, Silver Ridge. He controls the mines, the water, and holds the debt on nearly everyone. If he decides you are a problem, you will be." "Saving a man's life should not make me a problem," Eleanor stated plainly. "It does when that man is Caleb Rowe," Jamie explained, his face grim. "They blamed him for the mining accident last year where 23 men died. Langford claimed Caleb sabotaged the supports because they were arguing over water rights. The town believed him, and now they treat him like an outcast." "Did he do it?" Eleanor asked directly. "Caleb would never." Jamie's eyes flashed with anger. "Langford just needed someone to pin it on because Caleb would not sell him our creek water. So he turned my brother into the town villain," Eleanor finished for him, understanding all too well how power could twist the truth. A soft groan from the bedroom pulled them back to Caleb's side. His eyes found hers as he slowly came to. "Still here?" he rasped. "Still here," she confirmed, checking his pulse. It was stronger. You ought to get back to town before Langford decides I am bad for your reputation." Eleanor simply pulled a chair to the bedside. "My feet hurt, my back aches, and I have not eaten all day. I am staying right here until morning to make sure that wound of yours does not get infected. You are a stubborn woman. I am a practical one," she corrected. "Why did you really help me?" he asked, his voice low. "There is more to it, I can tell." Eleanor paused, her gaze drifting toward the dark window. "During the war, I was a nurse," she said quietly. "I saw surgeons let wounded boys die simply because they wore the wrong color uniform. I swore to myself then that I would never stand by and watch a person die just because others decided they were not worth saving. I do not care what they accuse you of. When I saw you bleeding while everyone else just watched, I knew what I had to do." A look of understanding crossed Caleb's face. "You have no idea what this will cost you." "Then I reckon I will find out," she said. "Now get some rest." She watched him drift off to sleep before joining Jamie in the kitchen. As she sipped the hot coffee he offered, a coyote howled in the distance. She had come to Silver Ridge for a quiet life, but instead she had found a fight. By dawn, the fever she feared had taken hold. As she cooled Caleb's forehead, he began to mutter in his delirium about the mine. He spoke of rotten timbers Langford refused to replace and a ledger hidden in the ranch's storm cellar. While Jamie watched his brother, Eleanor found the book. It was all there, a detailed record of Langford's shortcuts and negligence. That afternoon, Langford and the sheriff arrived. "Miss Hale," Langford began, his voice slick as oil, "you are associating with a murderer." "No," she replied, holding up the ledger. "I am associating with the man who tried to stop one." In front of the sheriff and the stunned townsfolk who had followed, she read Caleb's entries aloud, exposing Langford's greed for all to see. The truth cleared Caleb's name and put Langford in chains. Eleanor had not found a quiet life, but she had found a home, a purpose, and a good man. And she knew without a doubt that doing the right thing was always worth the cost. The hours that followed were a blur of cool cloths, clean bandages, and whispered prayers. The boy, Jaime, hovered by the door, his eyes wide with worry. While Caleb drifted in a feverish sleep, mumbling about water rights and collapsed mines, Eleanor finally looked at his brother. "You need to tell me what happened," she said, her voice steady. "If I'm standing in the path of a storm, I want to know which way the wind is blowing." Jaime took a long, shaky breath. "It was last October," he began, his voice low. "It was Langford's number 7 mine shaft. He dug it right up against our property line. Caleb fought with him for months about it. See, his mine was using up all the water from our creek. The cattle were going thirsty and our crops were dying. Langford wanted the whole creek lock, stock, and barrel. When Caleb told him no, things turned sour. Langford sent his men to ride through our land, spook our cattle, and tear down fences. They even poisoned our well once. Caleb went to the sheriff, but that lawman is bought and paid for by Langford. Then the number 7 mine collapsed. 23 good men lost their lives. Word is the support beams were cut on purpose. Since everyone knew Caleb and Langford were at odds, Langford pointed the finger straight at Caleb. He convinced the whole town Caleb was a killer, with no trial and not a shred of proof. Caleb would never do such a thing. He knew those miners. He sold beef to them, and they helped us with the branding. He grieved for every last one. We were nowhere near that mine when it happened. We were right here, fixing the barn roof. But Langford's man swore the damage was old, planned out. That is when folks started treating Caleb like a leper. You should head into town. Let them know I am here with Caleb, and find a woman named Mary Chen. Tell her everything. Are you certain about that? If Langford finds out you are still here, he will come after you. He already knows I helped Caleb. Staying here until his fever breaks is not going to make it any worse. Besides, I came here to be a teacher. The school board is expecting me." "The school board," Jamie said, his voice heavy. "Victor Langford is the chairman." "Of course he is," she whispered. Later that day, Eleanor sat by Caleb's bed, her mind racing. She had walked right into the middle of a range war. Langford had this town wrapped around his finger, and Caleb was the one man who refused to bend. The mine collapse was just the excuse Langford needed. She ought to be scared, ought to be figuring a way out of this mess. But she remembered making a choice like this before, in a hospital tent during the war, and she was making the same choice now. A stubborn woman, she muttered to herself. Takes one to know one, a rough voice answered from the bed. Caleb's eyes were open. He tried to sit up, but she gently pushed him back down. Where is Jamie? He went to town to let folks know you are alive and that the new teacher is taking care of the most hated man in town. You should not have stayed, Eleanor. Jamie told you what Langford claims I did. He told me what Langford claims. There is a big difference, not to the people in this town. If you help me, you become an enemy. Langford will not forgive it. Good, Eleanor said, checking his bandages. Then they will remember I am not a woman who backs down. This is not about principles. This is about staying alive. Langford has destroyed good people for a lot less than this. Then it is high time someone stood up to him. Not you, Caleb insisted. You just got here. You have a position to think about. Maybe. If the school board chairman, who happens to despise you, lets me keep it. Look, I know this will cost me, but the world does not get better when people take the easy way out. It gets better when they do what is right. He stared at her for a long time. You sound just like my mother. Was she stubborn too? Stubborn as a mule, he whispered, his eyes closing. She would have liked you. Why are you really here, Eleanor? A woman with your skills could work in any big city. Why come to a rough place like this? Because nowhere else would take me, she said plainly. The war changes a person. After it ended, I tried to go back to my old life, but my hands would not stop shaking. The nightmares were awful. The big city hospitals did not want a nurse who jumped at every loud noise. I needed to go somewhere I could be useful, somewhere the scars did not matter so much. I thought teaching children would be a peaceful change. And instead you found me, Caleb said. Instead, I found you, she agreed with a small smile. Bleeding out on the prairie. It seems to be the story of my life. Thank you, he said, his eyes meeting hers, for seeing past the scars. We all have them, she said softly. Some are just easier to see than others. Later, Jamie returned as the sun was setting, his face grim. Mary Chen says to come see her when you can. She also said you have really stirred up the hornet's nest. Langford has called a school board meeting for 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. They are going to discuss your fitness to teach. I spoke to old Doc Morrison, too. He said it is about time someone in this town remembered what it means to do the right thing. That man is serious, Eleanor. Langford's telling folks you're a reckless fool for helping Caleb. He's got this whole town scared to death or in his debt. You cross him, you lose it all. Eleanor thought about their fearful silence as Caleb bled. Then tomorrow, she said steady, I will have to give them a reason to fear their own conscience more than they fear him. Later, after Caleb's fever broke, he warned her, You are walking into a buzzsaw. Langford owns that school board. Probably, she admitted, smoothing his blanket. So why fight a losing battle? He asked. Because standing up for what is right matters, she said, her voice clear as a bell. And because if I back down now, I will never forgive myself. Standing up for what's right when everyone else is sitting down is a lonely business. In the small town of Silver Ridge, my decision to save a wounded man, Caleb Rowe, had turned me into an outcast. And now, I was about to lose my job for it. This story's about finding courage you never knew you had. And it's a reminder that a few good folks can make all the difference. As I stood by his bedside, Caleb told me his mother used to say courage was just doing the right thing even when you're scared spitless. He figured his mama would have stood with me. Then I'll stand for both of us, I told him. He thanked me for reminding him there was still some decency left in this town. That night I barely slept. Before the sun even thought about cracking the horizon, Caleb's brother, Jamie, had coffee brewing. He was a good man, stubborn like his brother, and insisted on riding into town with me. He said, Whatever they decide, you've got friends here. Me, Caleb, and a few others. It ain't much, but it's something. That was a whole lot more than I had yesterday. We ended up at Mary Chen's boarding house. She was a tough little woman who took one look at us and said, Y'all look like you could use some breakfast. Over bacon and biscuits, Mary laid it out plain. I heard what you did for Caleb. Foolish, but brave. She knew his mother, Sarah, and said she would have done the exact same thing. Then she got down to brass tacks. That school board meeting is an ambush, honey. Langford has it all rigged. She explained that the whole board owed Langford money or favors. The preacher, the store owner, even the mayor's wife, Margaret Thornton, was too scared of him to stand up. So what do I do? I asked. Mary leaned in close. You remind them what this is really about. It's not about you saving one man. It's about whether they want a teacher with principles or a puppet who'll bend to the likes of Langford. She looked me square in the eye. You're a teacher, Eleanor. Go teach 'em a lesson. I walked into that meeting alone. Victor Langford sat at the head of the table looking smug. The others were lined up beside him, just like Mary said they would be. It was time for school to start. Langford's voice was as smooth as river water over stones. Miss Hale, we brought you here to talk about your conduct. You gave aid to Caleb Rowe, a man we believe is a murderer. I sat up straight, feeling like I was on trial. He's been accused, I said, keeping my voice steady. That don't make him guilty. Langford's smile was all teeth. You put yourself in harm's way for a dangerous man. I gave medical care to a man who was shot. That's just my training. He leaned in, his voice low. What you showed was poor judgment. A teacher in this town has to be beyond question. I looked him square in the eye. What I showed was decency. Maybe the parents here should ask why they stood by and watched a man bleed out. What lesson did y'all teach your children yesterday when you chose fear over doing what's right? Langford's face hardened. You dare come in here and judge us? His anger finally showed. I know this town has suffered, I said, my voice softening a bit. But blaming an innocent man for it ain't justice. It's just plain vengeance. Someone else spoke up. You have no proof he's innocent. And you have no proof he's guilty, I shot back. Then Margaret Thornton, who'd been quiet the whole time, asked me, What would you teach them, Miss Hale? I looked right at her. I'd teach them to ask questions and to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. I'd teach them that courage isn't about being convenient. I stood up then, knowing I'd said my piece. Go on and vote me out. But think about what that says about Silver Ridge when decency loses and fear wins. I walked out of that church with my heart pounding. Mary Chen was waiting on the steps for me. I told them the truth, I said, feeling all wrung out. Truth always matters, she said, patting my hand. An hour later, Reverend Mitchell found us. He was sweating buckets. Miss Hale, he stammered, the board has decided the job is yours. Turns out it was a 3-to-1 vote. Mrs. Thornton had insisted. She told him her daughter deserved a teacher with some backbone. Mary just smiled. Margaret's been waiting a long time for someone to stand up to Langford. But you watch your back. He ain't the kind to lose with grace. Then I won't give him a reason, I said. That evening I couldn't stop thinking about Caleb. I borrowed Mary's mare and rode out to his ranch. I found him on the porch, a blanket over his legs. He looked pale, but his face lit up when he saw me. You're all right, he said. I'm employed, I told him, sitting down. Barely. He was quiet for a long moment. Thank you, he finally said, his voice rough, for not backing down. Most folks would have. Well, I ain't most folks. He looked at me in the fading light. No, he said, you sure ain't. We sat there as the stars came out, a peaceful quiet between us. I knew I should go, but I didn't move. I had a feeling I'd finally found a place worth fighting for. My first day at the schoolhouse was a trial by fire. The place smelled of old books and chalk dust. 16 pairs of eyes stared me down, full of suspicion their parents had planted. A boy in the back, Thomas Cartwright, shot his hand up. Is it true you saved the man who killed all them miners? I looked right at him. I saved a man who'd been shot. It's up to a court to decide if he's guilty, not me. My job was to keep him from dying, and I did my job. I told them that in my classroom, we deal with facts and we think for ourselves. I believe every person deserves help when they're hurt. That didn't make the tension vanish, but it gave it somewhere to go. We could work with that. The kids were a mix, just like their parents. Some were angry, some were hopeful. But it turned out that half of them could barely read. That gave me my purpose. I had good, hard work to do, and that kind of work doesn't leave much time for worrying about whispers. Life settled into a rhythm. I'd teach all day, then ride out to Caleb's ranch every few days to check on his wound. The ride was peaceful, and seeing him and Jamie was a comfort. Caleb was getting stronger with every visit. One afternoon, as I was changing his bandage, I told him the wound was nearly healed. "Guess that means you'll stop coming out here," he said, his voice quiet. "The medical reason will be gone," I admitted. "But I reckon I can find other reasons." I told him the truth, that he, his brother, and Mary were the only folks in town who looked at me like a person instead of a problem. He gently took my hand. "Eleanor, is it bad in town?" I should have said it was fine, but I couldn't. I told him how the parents watched me, just waiting for me to fail. "It's not good," I said. "They're just waiting." I didn't know then that they wouldn't have to wait long for the other shoe to drop. It is not easy being the new school teacher in a town that has already made up its mind about you. The good ladies from the church social looked at me like I was carrying the plague. But I chose this fight. Besides, the mayor's wife, Margaret Thornton, invited me for tea. It seems her husband is not as charmed by Victor Langford as everyone else. The man's empire is starting to show some cracks. But Langford is a dangerous man to cross. He already knows I am trouble. He's been visiting my classroom, calling it an observation. He just sits in the back, scribbling in a notebook, looking for any little thing he can use to run me out of town. So far, my teaching has been perfectly fine, and it is driving him crazy. "Good," Caleb said, pouring us both a cup of coffee. "You're a lot tougher than you look." I have had to be. We drank in a comfortable quiet, the kind that grows between two people who have seen each other through the worst of times. "Tell me about the water," I said. "Everyone says you and Langford are fighting over water rights, but why is it so important here?" Caleb stared out the window for a moment. "My father settled this land back in '52 because of the creek. It has year-round water from mountain springs. Most ranches around here go dry by August, but ours never does. Then the mines came and everything changed. Mining uses more water than you can imagine. Langford's mine alone drinks thousands of gallons every single day. The first year his big mine opened, our creek dropped 2 feet. The cattle went thirsty. My mother's vegetable garden just withered and died. We had to dig our well deeper just to have water for the house. So when Langford offered to buy your water rights, he wanted it all. He wanted to drain our creek for his mines and leave our ranch to turn to dust. I tried to make a fair deal to share the water, but that was not enough for him. Men like Victor Langford always want everything. He is building an empire, and our little ranch is in his way. When I refused to sell, he found another way to get what he wanted. He turned the whole town against me. He used that terrible mining accident. 23 men lost their lives, and overnight he made me into a murderer. He had his engineer testify that the sabotage happened weeks before, which gave me a motive with our water dispute. "Tell me about the engineer," I said. "A man named Robert Fletcher. He is smart, and Langford pays him a handsome sum to say whatever Langford needs him to say. I cannot prove it, but I know it in my gut. Well, I worked as a nurse for 3 years, and I learned to spot a liar a mile away. Something about that man is not right. An engineer who finds sabotage in a mine would report it right away. He would shut the whole thing down before anyone got hurt. He would not wait until after 23 men were dead to bring it up. Unless he did not find sabotage at all." "What if the collapse was just an accident?" I said, my mind racing. "What if it was caused by shoddy work or cheap materials because Langford was cutting corners to save money? When it all went wrong, Langford needed someone to blame, and you were the perfect target. You're saying Victor Langford framed me for murder just to cover up his own greed." Caleb's voice was low. "If you start asking these questions, he will come after you twice as hard. He will destroy you." "He is already trying," I said, meeting his gaze. At least this way, I am fighting back. This is not your fight, Eleanor. It became my fight the moment I decided to save your life. You think I can teach those children about truth while watching a good man be railroaded? Caleb reached out and gently touched my face. You barely know me. I know enough, I whispered. I know you grieved for those men. I know you would rather lose everything than give up what you believe in. And I know that when you look at me, you just see Eleanor. That is more than I have had in a very long time. Just then, a voice called from the yard, breaking the spell. Caleb, we have got riders coming. We stepped onto the porch as 3 men on horseback rode up. I recognized Sheriff Porter out front. Stay behind me, Caleb said. I am not going anywhere. The sheriff got off his horse looking like he would rather be anywhere else. The 2 men with him stayed mounted, their hands resting near their guns. Sheriff, Caleb said, what can I do for you? I need to ask you some questions, Caleb. There was another incident at the number 7 mine. More support beams were damaged. Fresh this time. Langford thinks you know something about it. A chill went down my spine. When did this happen? The engineer found it this morning, Porter said, his eyes flicking over to me. I suppose you would not know where Caleb was last night, would you, Miss Hale? He was right here, I said, my voice sharp. He is recovering from a gunshot wound. He can barely make it to the barn, let alone ride 15 miles to a mine. I can vouch for that, a voice called from the barn. It was Jamie. He was here all night. We played cards until almost midnight. The sheriff sighed. Look, I'm not saying you did it, Caleb, but Langford is making a lot of noise. He's threatening to bring in federal marshals for a proper investigation. Federal marshals? Caleb let out a harsh laugh. To investigate damage that just happens to show up right when he needs another reason to come after me. I am just saying it is mighty convenient timing. And I'm saying I have got witnesses that prove I was nowhere near that mine. The sheriff's warning was plain as day. Langford has influence all the way to the governor, Caleb. He will not stop. Caleb's jaw was like granite. Well, I am not sellin', and I am not leavin'. As the sheriff rode off, Eleanor turned to him. That was a threat. We need to act before he invents a crime you cannot shake. She knew just who to see. Doc Morrison opened the door, his eyes still sharp despite his trembling hands. Miss Hale, he said with a wry smile. Heard you were making trouble. That is either guts or foolishness. I need to ask you about the mining accident, Eleanor said, getting straight to the point. The doctor's smile vanished. Come in, he said, his voice low. I saw things that did not match the official story. The wood was not cut, Doc Morrison explained. It splintered from too much weight. It was not sabotage. He looked tired. I tried to tell them. Langford's doctor from Denver called me an old man whose eyes were failing. The inquest believed him. But you kept your notes, Eleanor guessed. The old doctor nodded, pulling a leather journal from a locked drawer. It is all in here. It is not legal proof, but it is the truth. He handed it to her. You be careful. Langford is a dangerous man to corner. Back in her room, Eleanor read the meticulous notes. The doctor was right. The injuries were from a cave-in caused by pure neglect, which meant Fletcher had lied. A sudden, urgent knock rattled her door. Downstairs, Margaret Thornton was waiting, her face pale with fear. Miss Hale, thank God, she stammered. We must speak, privately. Margaret's voice was tight as a new rope. She told me my husband got a letter from the territorial governor. Federal marshals are coming to look into Caleb Rose and those mine troubles. They'll be here inside of a week. My stomach just about hit the floor. It was Langford's doing, I knew it. He's got powerful friends, and painted Caleb as some kind of monster. Margaret looked me square in the eye. They're going to arrest Caleb on sight, she said. The trial will be a sham in Denver, where Langford owns everyone. They're fixin' to hang him. Why tell me, I asked. Because you're the only one with enough sand to face that man. And because I heard something. At a dinner party, I overheard Langford fussing about the cost of the number 7 mine. He said Fletcher told him they could use cheaper wood than what the plans called for, saving a pile of money. I wrote it all down right after. When that mine collapsed and Langford blamed Caleb so fast, I was too scared to speak. But I'm more scared of my little girl growing up where men like that get away with murder. She handed me a folded piece of paper. I don't know if this is any help, but I can't keep quiet no more. I sat there holding Margaret's note and Morrison's journal. The whole ugly picture was finally clear. Langford cheaped out on timbers to save a few dollars. 23 good men paid with their lives. And Langford, instead of facing the music, pointed the finger at Caleb. Now, with federal lawmen on the way, I had a choice. I could go to Sheriff Porter, but he was deep in Langford's pocket. Or I could do what the war taught me. When the system is broken, you go around it. I found Mary in the kitchen. I need a horse for tomorrow, I told her, and I need you to handle my classes. Where are you headed, she asked. To Denver. I know a fella at a newspaper there. If the law won't give us justice, maybe the people will. Mary just nodded. Take the gray mare. She's got grit. And Eleanor, you be careful. After I left, I rode south under the cover of darkness. In my saddlebag, I carried the truth and a sliver of hope. I found the newspaper office just as the city was waking up. James Mitchell had been a friend for years. Eleanor knew one man who might listen. Mitchell, her old war correspondent friend, was an editor now. She remembered his gentleness with wounded soldiers, a stark contrast to his hunt for the truth. He looked older, but his eyes were just as sharp. She laid out the whole story, and he read Morrison's notes with a deep focus. This is something, he said. It won't hold up in court, but it'll sure make folks ask questions Langford don't want answered. When she asked if he'd print it, he got quiet. Langford's ads keep our lights on. He pulls them if I run this, and we might go under. Eleanor's heart sank. But, Mitchell continued with a hard smile, we'd go under with our integrity. That's worth more than his money. He promised to get the story ready in 2 days. Back in Silver Ridge, Eleanor found the town in an uproar. A notice was nailed to the church door. A federal inquiry was coming for Caleb, and the marshals were on their way. She felt a cold dread when she saw Victor Langford watching her from the edge of the crowd. Welcome back, Miss Hale, Langford said, his smile all ice. I trust your trip was useful. He knew. He had let her go, all while he was pulling strings to speed things up. She met his gaze. Very useful, Mr. Langford. His grin widened. A shame it won't change a thing. The law is clear about helping criminals. I'd hate for you to lose your job over it. My loyalty is to justice, she said firmly. Langford let out a soft, dangerous laugh. Justice, my dear lady, is whatever powerful men decide it is. He tipped his hat and walked off, leaving her standing there, her mind racing. The marshals were coming. Caleb was going to be arrested. Unless Mitchell's story got out in time, an innocent man was going to hang. Eleanor got on her horse and rode hard for Creek Bend Ranch. Caleb deserved to hear it from her. They would face this together, just like they'd faced everything else. The sun was low when she reached the ranch. Caleb and Jamie were in the barn mending tack. He looked up and the hope in his eyes died when he saw her face. The marshals, she said, no preamble. They're coming early. Langford sped it up. How do you know? Caleb's voice was flat. I went to Denver. I took the evidence to an editor I know. She was tired, clear to the bone. Langford found out. This is his way of hitting back. You went to Denver without telling me? Anger finally broke through his control. Eleanor, do you know what you've done? You've painted a target right on your own back. I was already a target, she shot back. The minute I decided to help you, I was in this fight. You don't get to tell me when I can stand up. I'm trying to protect you. I don't need protecting. I need you to trust me. She handed him Morrison's journal. Mitchell is going to publish the story. It might not stop the arrest, but it'll make a trial mighty difficult for them. This could ruin you, Caleb said, his anger softening. Langford will see to it you never teach again in this territory. Then I'll go somewhere else, she said, looking him straight in the eye. But I won't stand by and watch you hang. Why? He asked, the question raw. Why risk it all for me? She couldn't tell him everything she felt, not with Jamie there. Because it's the right thing to do, she said simply. And because somebody has to. Jaime quietly slipped out to check the horses, giving them a moment alone. Caleb set the journal down gently. I can't let you throw your life away for me. It's my life to throw. Eleanor stepped closer. For 3 years, I've been running from my past, from the war. Coming here was supposed to be a fresh start. She touched his scarred hand. But I learned something. Running doesn't fix a thing. Maybe standing up to Langford, fighting for you. Maybe this is the first real thing I've done since the war ended. He turned his hand over, tangling their fingers together. You're the bravest woman I've ever met. I'm scared to death. That's what makes it brave, he said, pulling her close. Eleanor, if this goes bad, promise me you'll walk away. Build the life you came here for. I can't promise that, she said, her voice fierce. I couldn't promise to leave you bleeding on the prairie, and I can't promise to abandon you now. For a long moment, they just stood there. Then he leaned down and kissed her, gentle and careful. She kissed him back with all the fear and fight she had inside her. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. I don't deserve you. Probably not, she said with a shaky smile, but you're stuck with me anyway. The Marshalls were just days away. Caleb wasn't about to run, that'd just prove Langford's lies, but he wasn't going to make it easy on them either. Our plan was simple. I'd keep teaching, acting normal. Jamie would ride out to the other ranches, letting folks know the real story. It ain't much of a plan, Jamie said. It's what we've got, I told him, laying a hand on Caleb's. We have the truth. He kissed me then, and for a moment the fear went quiet. Mary was waiting for me back in town. They're coming, I told her. Mary just poured the tea. You ain't alone in this, Eleanor. A lot of folks are on your side. They're just too scared to say it. Men like Langford, they seem like giants right up until they fall. You just have to be standing when they do. 2 days later, I was walking to the schoolhouse at dawn when I saw him. A single rider talking low with Sheriff Porter. The marshal had arrived. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I kept walking. The fight was here. Her stomach just about hit the floor. The marshals were here. Later that day, Sheriff Porter filled the schoolhouse doorway, looking like he would rather be anywhere else. He told her the marshals were riding out to Creek Bend that afternoon to arrest Caleb. He warned her that Langford had been bending their ear and that they would want to question her too. Eleanor closed the school down and rode with Mary out to the ranch. They arrived just as 3 men on federal horses came over the rise. The lead marshal, a man named Carter with a hard face and a scar through his eyebrow, got off his horse. Caleb was waiting on the porch. The marshal announced he had a warrant for Caleb's arrest, for sabotage and conspiracy to commit murder in the deaths of 23 miners. He told Caleb he could come peacefully or by force. Caleb read the warrant, his expression like stone. He said, "This is based on the word of Victor Langford, the very man who has been trying to run me off my land for 2 years. The marshal was not moved. That is for the courts to decide. Now, are you coming? Before Caleb could answer, Eleanor stepped forward. Marshal Carter, she said, her voice steady. I have evidence that contradicts these charges. I have medical proof that the mine collapsed from poor construction, not from sabotage. Carter barely gave her a glance. And who are you, ma'am? I'm a nurse who treated the men. I know the difference between a cave-in and an explosion. Then you can present your proof at trial, he said, turning back to Caleb. Hands behind your back. Eleanor watched, helpless, as they put the iron cuffs on Caleb's wrists. As they led him away, his eyes met hers, filled not with fear, but with resolve. We have to ride to Denver, Eleanor said the moment the marshals were out of sight. Mary caught her arm. Eleanor, that is a hard day's ride. By the time we get to Mitchell at the newspaper, it might be too late. Then we ride fast, Eleanor insisted. I will not just stand here and do nothing. So they rode like the devil was on their heels, pushing through the sunset and into the night. They reached Denver close to midnight, and Eleanor pounded on the newspaper office door until a very sleepy Mitchell answered. "They arrested him," she said, breathing hard. "They took Caleb. You have to print the story tonight before Langford can bury him." Mitchell looked weary. "Eleanor, the presses are cold. It would take hours." "Then we start now," she declared. He saw the fire in her eyes, and finally he nodded. "We can have copies on the street by dawn." The newspaper office roared to life in the dead of night. As the sky outside began to lighten, the first paper came off the press. The headline was stark: "Mining Disaster or Murder." The article laid out all the evidence, from medical testimony to suspicious timing, all pointing toward Langford. By sunrise, newsboys were shouting the story all over Denver. Eleanor and Mary hurried to the federal courthouse, where a crowd had already gathered, newspapers in hand. A clerk was posting a notice on the door: "Hearing postponed pending review of new evidence." Relief washed over Eleanor so strongly she nearly fell. It was a delay. It was a chance. "That was your doing, wasn't it?" She turned to see Marshal Carter on the steps behind her. "The truth was there," she said, meeting his gaze. "It just needed to be told." He studied her for a moment, then gave a slight nod. "I have been a marshal for 15 years, he said. "When a powerful man like Victor Langford pushes this hard for an arrest, it usually means he is the one with something to hide. I believe a man pushing this hard for a conviction has something to hide," Carter, the head marshal, told me. "So you think Caleb's innocent?" "I think this whole thing stinks," he said, rolling a cigar between his fingers. "The hearing's been pushed back a week. If you have more proof, now's the time to dig it up." He told me Caleb was being held in a federal cell downtown. The place was as grim as you'd expect. Caleb looked up when I walked in, and the look on his face just about broke my heart. "You did it," he said. "You published the story." "Mitchell did," I corrected, gripping the cold iron bars. "We bought some time, Caleb, but we need more than questions. We need solid proof that Fletcher lied." "The mine records," he said, his hands covering mine. "Langford keeps records of everything: material orders, inspections. If Fletcher approved cheap lumber, there's a paper trail. But they'll be locked up in his office at the mine, guarded day and night." "What about Fletcher himself?" I asked. "If we could just get him to talk." "He won't," Caleb said. "Langford pays him too much, and he's scared to death." "Everybody's scared of something," I whispered. "We just have to figure out what scares Fletcher more than Langford." Eleanor knew what she had to do. If the law wouldn't help, they'd have to bend it. She told Mary she had a plan to get the records, the proof that Langford used cheap materials in that mine. Eleanor believed she knew just the person who could help. They found Doc Morrison at his home. He listened quietly as Eleanor laid out her idea. She wanted him, as a doctor, to request the records to investigate the deaths. It would force Langford's hand. If he refused, he'd look guilty as sin. If he agreed, they'd have the proof they needed to clear Caleb. The old doctor sighed, looking at his trembling hands. He said the town brass had already dismissed him once as a confused old man. Eleanor gently told him this time was different. With the newspaper and federal marshals sniffing around, they couldn't ignore him. She reminded him that 23 men were dead and an innocent man was taking the fall. He looked her in the eye, and she saw the man he used to be, the man who stood for truth. "All right," he said softly. "I'll request those records first thing in the morning." Eleanor was too worn out to ride back home, so she stayed the night in Denver. She barely slept, and when she woke, her hands were shaking something awful. Mary found her staring at them. She tried to brush it off, but Mary sat down and took her trembling hands. "You're not falling apart," Mary said firmly. "You're just human, and being brave means you do things even when you're scared." At 9 o'clock sharp, Doc Morrison was at the courthouse with his written request. The clerk took it, then came back 20 minutes later with a sour-faced official. The man announced they could not grant the request. The records had been sealed by order of the governor himself. "At whose request?" Morrison asked. "Mr. Langford's," came the reply. "He claimed it was to protect his business." Eleanor's heart sank. Langford had outsmarted them again. Doc Morrison, however, wasn't done. He told the official, his voice shaking with anger, that an investigation that hides evidence is nothing but a cover-up. He promised to tell the federal marshals exactly that. Outside on the courthouse steps, Eleanor knew their legal options were gone. They needed someone on the inside, someone with access to Langford's office and a good reason to betray him. She asked Doc who might fit that bill. He thought for a moment. "John Spencer," he said. "He's the new mine foreman. His younger brother died in that collapse, and he never did buy that sabotage story." Eleanor knew what she had to do. "I'm going to ask him," she said, cutting off Mary's worried look. "Just ask him if he wants the truth to finally come out." She found John Spencer at the mine, a man with sorrow etched deep in his face. He recognized her as the teacher who was trying to help Caleb. "I think your brother and 22 other men are dead because Langford cut corners," she said plainly. "And I believe the proof is locked away in his office." Spencer listened, his jaw tight, as she showed him Doc Morrison's journal detailing the injuries. The evidence pointed to a structural failure, not sabotage. "If what you're saying is true," Spencer said, his voice hard, "then the man responsible for my brother's death is walking free." Eleanor met his gaze. "I need to see those records, Mr. Spencer. You're one of the only people who can get them." He knew the risk. If Langford found out, he'd be ruined. He stared at the dark entrance of the mine that took his brother. "I'll see what I can do," he finally said. "But Langford is always watching. This will take time." Eleanor thanked him, a small bit of hope fighting the fear in her heart. They had 6 days. That night, Eleanor went back to Caleb's cell. She laid it all out for him, how Morrison had asked for help, how Spencer had cautiously agreed, and how they had 1 week to build a case that would set him free. "You've already done so much," Caleb said, his voice just a whisper. "Eleanor, if this goes sideways, we appeal. We keep fighting. We don't ever give up." Eleanor put her hands on the bars. "Caleb, for 3 years, I have been running from fights I knew I could not win. I am not running anymore." He reached out, his fingers finding hers. "What about after? If we win this, what happens then?" The question hung in the air between them, full of hope and fear. Eleanor thought of her schoolhouse, the ranch, and the cottonwood trees his mother planted. "Then we build something," she said softly. "Something worth all this. You and me." Caleb pulled her hands to his lips. "I love you, Eleanor Hale. I think I have loved you since the day you came tearing across that prairie like an angel of justice." Her throat felt tight. "I love you too. And that is why we are going to win." 3 days crawled by. Eleanor went back to teaching in a town split right down the middle by the newspaper story. Some folks pulled their children from her class. Others offered quiet nods of support on the street. Margaret Thornton showed up one afternoon with a sworn statement. "My husband is furious," she said. "But my Alice asked why I was not being brave like you. I did not have a good answer for her." On the 4th day, a boy from the mines ran up to the schoolhouse. "Miss Hale," he panted, "Mr. Spencer sent me. He says he has what you need." The message was simple. Spencer would meet her at 9 o'clock at the old smelting shed south of town. Eleanor's heart hammered in her chest, but she agreed. She told Mary, who warned her it sounded an awful lot like a trap. Eleanor knew it might be, but this was their only chance to save Caleb. At the rundown shed, a frightened John Spencer pushed a leather portfolio into her hands. Inside was proof, he said, that Langford knowingly used cheap timbers in the mine. Just as Eleanor took it, the shed door flew open. Lanterns lit up the darkness, and there stood Victor Langford with Sheriff Porter and 3 of his deputies. Langford, slick as ever, accused them of theft and told the sheriff to arrest them both. Eleanor felt a cold dread creep over her. But then Mary Chen stepped right out of the shadows where she'd been hiding. She spoke up loud and clear, saying she was a witness. She said she heard Langford all but admit those papers would prove his negligence killed 23 men. Eleanor backed her up, declaring the documents were evidence in a federal investigation. Sheriff Porter, looking mighty conflicted, finally made his choice. He sided with them, telling Langford he had no right to seize the papers. They walked out of that shed, leaving Langford fuming and making empty threats. With the portfolio clutched tight, Eleanor and Mary rode straight through the night toward Denver. They arrived just as the sun was coming up. Worn out but full of purpose, Eleanor went directly to the federal courthouse. She found Marshal Carter at his desk and laid the evidence before him. She explained how the documents proved the mine collapse was no accident. Carter began looking through the papers, his face unreadable. He saw the orders for cheaper wood and the falsified inspection reports, all bearing Langford's signature. The silence in the room was heavy. Finally, Carter looked up and said the evidence was explosive. He would need to check it all. But if it was genuine, Caleb would walk free. Relief washed over Eleanor, so strong she nearly fell. She went straight to the jail to tell Caleb the news. He could barely believe their fight was almost over. He quietly promised that the moment he was free, he would take her to a beautiful place up in the mountains, a place his own mother had cherished, a place on this earth. His gray eyes locked with hers. "I want to show it to you. I think anywhere with you would be beautiful." A small, vulnerable smile touched his lips. "Stay with me tonight. Just talk to me until they make you leave. I do not want to be alone in this cell if it is my last night." So Eleanor stayed. She sat on the cold floor and they talked about everything and nothing, about the choices that brought them right to this moment. Around midnight, a guard told her that visiting hours were over. She stood up, her body aching from the hard stone. "I will see you tomorrow," she said, "in the courtroom when they set you free." "Eleanor," Caleb's voice stopped her. "Whatever happens, thank you. Thank you for fighting for me when no one else would." She could not find the words to answer, so she just nodded and walked out before he could see her cry. The next morning, the courtroom was packed to the gills. Eleanor saw Mary Chen, Doc Morrison, and Margaret Thornton. In the back sat John Spencer, looking tired but determined, and in the front row, flanked by his fancy lawyers, sat Victor Langford. His eyes met hers, filled with a cold rage. Eleanor lifted her chin and stared right back. "You are going to lose," she thought, "and you know it." Marshal Carter came in, followed by a distinguished older man. "This hearing will come to order," Carter announced. "We are here to review the charges against Caleb Rowe and examine new evidence. I have asked Judge Marcus Brennan from the Territorial District to oversee these proceedings." Judge Brennan's courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension. He gavelled the room to order and called on Marshal Carter. Carter didn't waste a minute. He laid out the whole ugly truth, plain as day. He showed the original plans for the number 7 shaft, the ones calling for good, strong timber. Then he held up the order, signed by Langford himself, swapping them out for cheaper wood to save a buck. He presented Fletcher's inspection reports, the ones that called the flimsy supports safe. The final nail in the coffin was the doctor's testimony. The men died from a cave-in, pure and simple, not sabotage. When Robert Fletcher took the stand, he was pale as a ghost. Under Carter's questions, he fell apart. He admitted Langford had pressured him, promised him bonuses to cut corners, and then threatened him into blaming Caleb when it all went wrong. When Eleanor walked to the front, the judge told her she didn't have to speak. But she insisted. She said this wasn't just about papers and proof. It was about a whole town so scared of one man they'd let another bleed to death. She told them how Langford tried to ruin her, to run her out of town, all to keep her quiet. "I held boys who died in the war," Eleanor said, her voice steady and clear. "They died because powerful men made bad choices. I swore I would never again stand by while the innocent suffered for the powerful." She looked Langford dead in the eye. 23 men are gone because Victor Langford valued his money more than their lives. Then he tried to destroy an innocent man to cover his tracks. I refuse to live in a world where we let fear make that acceptable." A low rumble went through the courtroom before the judge's gavel cracked like a whip. "Order!" he boomed. Then he called for the defendant. When Caleb Rowe walked in, shackled between two guards, his eyes found Eleanor's and stayed there. The judge looked him over. "Mr. Rowe," he said, "you've heard the testimony. Do you have anything to say?" Caleb stood tall. "I didn't kill those men," he said, his voice rough. "They were my neighbors." His gaze shifted to Langford, full of a year's worth of pain. "You took everything from me because I wouldn't sell you my water rights. You were willing to let me hang to hide what you did," Caleb said, turning back to the judge. "I am not asking for pity. I am asking for the truth to finally matter. I am asking for justice for those 23 men, and I am asking to go home." The room was dead silent. Judge Brennan turned to the marshal. "Your recommendation?" Carter's voice was like stone. "Dismiss all charges against Caleb Rowe immediately, and open a full criminal investigation into Victor Langford for the deaths of 23 minors." The judge nodded. "Mr. Langford, stand up." Langford shot to his feet, his calm finally breaking. "Your Honor, this is a sham, based on stolen papers and lies." The judge's voice was ice. "It is based on evidence you tried to bury, Mr. Langford, evidence of negligence and conspiracy." He ordered Langford to remain in the territory, then turned to Caleb. "Mr. Rowe, all charges are dismissed. You are a free man with this court's deepest apology." As the guards cut the shackles from Caleb's wrists, he found Eleanor in the crowd. In 3 steps, she was in his arms. "It is over," she whispered. He held her tight. "You did this," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved me. Twice." "We saved each other," she said, pulling back to look at his face. "That is how this works." Behind them, Marshal Carter was arresting Victor Langford. Justice, real and true, had finally come. In the weeks that followed, Langford was charged with negligent homicide. With Fletcher as the state's star witness, the outcome was certain. The town of Silver Ridge, which had once shunned Eleanor, now treated her like a hero. Parents brought their children back to her school with humble apologies. Margaret Thornton told her, "You made us look at ourselves, at how fear had been running our lives." Eleanor taught her students about more than just books. She taught them about courage and truth. One afternoon, Thomas Cartwright, the boy who'd been so angry at first, stayed after class. "Miss Hale," he said, "I am sorry for believing the lies. You taught us to think for ourselves, and I should have." "The important thing is that you are doing it now," Eleanor told him gently. Every Sunday, she'd ride out to Caleb's ranch. They'd sit on the porch for hours, talking as the sun went down. Surrounded by the quiet mountains and the man she'd fought for, Eleanor finally felt like she was home, now that his family's name was cleared. "What are your plans for the ranch?" Eleanor asked one evening while they walked by the creek. "Keep raising cattle," Caleb said, his hand finding hers. "Maybe get a bigger herd now that Langford is not breathing down our necks. The water is ours now. We can share it with the neighbors. Build a proper irrigation system for everyone." "That sounds like a whole lot of work." "It is," he said, stopping to face her. "I was hoping you might want to help me with it." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. "Caleb, I have my teaching. I love those children." "I am not asking you to give that up," he said, cupping her face in his rough hands. "But I am asking if you would consider making this your home. If you would marry me and build a life here with me." The proposal was just like him, straight and honest. Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes. "I still have nightmares," she whispered. "Sometimes my hands shake." "I have them too," Caleb said, his thumb brushing her cheek. "We are both scarred, Eleanor. But maybe that is why we fit together. We know what it means to survive." "I love teaching." "Then keep teaching. Or we could build a small school right here for the ranch families. I am not asking you to give up anything. I am asking you to add to what you have with me." She thought about the life he was offering, a life of teaching truth and coming home to a man who saw her scars and loved her anyway. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." He kissed her then, as the first evening star appeared in the sky. When they finally broke apart, Eleanor was laughing and crying all at once. "My mother would have loved you," Caleb said. "She always said us Roe men need strong women to keep us honest." "Well, lucky for you, I am very good at keeping people honest." They were married 6 weeks later by the creek, under the cottonwood trees. Doc Morrison gave Eleanor away, and Mary Chen stood as her witness. Jamie was Caleb's best man, grinning so wide his face might have split. Half the town came to watch. Sheriff Porter was there in his dress uniform, having resigned to take a job with the Territorial Marshal Service. Even John Spencer came with his family to celebrate the truth that had cost him his job, but given him back his soul. The one man missing was Victor Langford, who was sitting in a Denver jail awaiting trial for the deaths of 23 minors. The ceremony was simple. Eleanor and Caleb spoke their vows as the creek murmured beside them. "I promise to stand beside you," Eleanor said, her voice clear. "In good times and in hard times. I promise to fight for you, to believe in you, and to choose you every single day." Caleb's voice was rough with emotion when he replied, "I promise to see you, just Eleanor. I promise to build a home with you where truth and courage matter. I promise to love you until the creek runs dry and the mountains fall." Doc Morrison pronounced them married, with tears running down his weathered face. Caleb kissed his bride, and as the crowd cheered, Eleanor felt a deep peace settle in her heart. The wedding celebration was a joyful commotion, with tables full of food from folks who had once turned their backs on the Roe name. As the sun began to set, Caleb led Eleanor up to a quiet spot by the creek he knew from his boyhood. He guided her to a hidden meadow where the stream bubbled up from a series of crystal-clear pools. "This is it," Caleb said, his voice low. "The source. This is what we fought so hard for." He explained that this spring was the beginning of everything, the very lifeblood that kept the ranch going. Eleanor looked at the constant flow of water, then at the man beside her who refused to bend on what was right. "It is beautiful," she whispered. Caleb gave her a tender smile. "Not as beautiful as you standing right here choosing this hard life with me." "I think that is what makes us a good match," Eleanor said, wrapping her arms around him. "We both understand that courage is not about being fearless. It means you are scared to death, but you do the right thing anyway." Under the stars, they laid out their plans for the future. Eleanor would continue teaching and help on the ranch during the summers. They dreamed of starting a proper clinic for families who lived too far out of town. "I want children," Caleb said into the quiet. A warmth bloomed in Eleanor's chest. "I want that too. Children who will know their father was a man of integrity, and their mother was a woman who saved lives when others looked away." Their life settled into a comfortable rhythm. On school days, Eleanor taught the town children how to ask questions and think for themselves. Thomas Cartwright, once an angry boy, became one of her best students. On her days off, she worked beside Caleb, her hands that had once trembled now steady from good, honest labor. She and Doc Morrison started a small clinic in an old ranch building, giving care to anyone who needed it. Finally, word arrived from Denver that Victor Langford had been found guilty. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. His company sold to repay the families he had destroyed. It was not perfect, Eleanor thought, but it was justice. Silver Ridge itself began to change for the better. With Langford's shadow gone, the town started to thrive. The fair system for sharing water that Caleb had proposed years ago was finally put in place. "We all let fear make us quiet," Margaret Thornton told Eleanor one afternoon. "You reminded us what courage looks like." As Eleanor rode home that evening, she knew she had won a different kind of battle here, one fought with truth instead of violence. Caleb was waiting on the porch. He helped her down from her horse, his hands warm and steady on her waist. "Jaime is attempting to cook dinner," Caleb said with a grin. "He says it is not beans. Should I be worried?" Eleanor laughed. "You should be terrified." But his eyes were dancing as they walked inside together. Jaime insisted she try his gravy, and bless his heart, it was actually good. He grinned, saying Mary was teaching him how to cook so he could properly feed a wife someday. As the sun went down, the three of them sat together talking about the day's work. It was then Eleanor realized she'd found more than a place to live. She'd found a family. Later, walking by the creek, Caleb told her about a letter from the governor. The new mine safety rules were to be named the Number 7 Protocols, a memorial for the men they'd lost. It felt right, their sacrifice making things safer for others. Eleanor then told Caleb her own idea. She wanted to expand the clinic, to make it a permanent place for folks who couldn't afford to travel for care. She knew it was a lot of work, but it felt like her purpose, a way to use the hard lessons from the war for something good. She told him the nightmares were finally starting to fade. Caleb pulled her in close. He promised they would build it together, getting all the proper supplies. When she asked if he was sure, he just smiled. "Darling, I didn't marry you to keep you penned in. I married you because your heart makes this world a better place. Whatever you aim to build, we'll build it side by side." The seasons rolled on by. Eleanor taught a full schoolhouse, the clinic grew to help folks from all over, and young Jaime started sweet-talking one of the Morrison girls. Then, one warm spring morning, Eleanor knew she was carrying Caleb's child. She told him that evening down by the creek, and watched his face light up with a fierce, wonderful joy. He gently placed a hand on her belly and whispered, "A baby. Our baby." He told her she had given him back everything he thought he'd lost. His future. Eleanor held his hand and said, "We gave it to each other." She reckoned that's what real love was, not about one person rescuing the other, but about two people standing strong together. Their daughter Sarah was born in the cold of January, with her mama's dark hair and her daddy's gray eyes. Holding that tiny baby, Eleanor felt the broken pieces of her soul mend. She finally understood that healing wasn't about the scars disappearing. It was about having something precious enough to make bearing them worthwhile. It was about building a future instead of just trying to forget the past. It all started with a terrible injustice. A good man left to die, and a woman who refused to let it happen. This is the story of how standing up for what is right, even when you are scared, can save more than just one life. It can save a whole town. Remember that one person's courage can change everything. Doc Morrison's shaky old hands were steady as a rock when he looked over their new baby girl. He declared, "She is perfect, strong like her mother." Caleb just grinned and said, "And stubborn, just like her father." In the years that followed, their daughter Sarah, a son named James, and another daughter Margaret, filled the ranch with a love that knew no fear. Eleanor kept teaching. Her clinic grew into a real hospital, and Creek Bend Ranch became a place known for its fairness. Silver Ridge changed from a town choked by fear into a community of good neighbors. Years later, with their children grown and making their own way, Eleanor and Caleb sat by the spring that started it all. Caleb looked at her and asked, "Do you ever wish you had done things different, taken the easier road?" Eleanor thought back to the frightened girl she used to be. Then she thought about the wife and mother she had become, and every hard choice that led her here. "Not for one second," she said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Every single scar was worth it." He put his arm around her. "It all started because you would not let me die out on that prairie." She smiled. "It started because you were a man worth saving, and because I was finally tired of running from a fight." They sat and watched the sunset, two people who found each other in the middle of all that trouble and built a good life from the ashes. The water from that spring flowed pure and constant, the source of everything they had made. In its reflection, Eleanor saw the truth of what they had fought for. It was not perfect, but it was whole, and it was home. The choices they made, the courage they showed, and the truth they defended would flow onward just like that creek. They had shown a whole town what it meant to be brave. They proved that good, ordinary people could stand up to the powerful and win, and that the right choice, even when it costs you dearly, is always the right choice. The stars began to appear one by one in the big Texas sky. In that meadow where the creek began, two people who fought for what was right sat hand in hand. They looked at all they had survived and all they had built. The water flowed, the mountains stood watch, and their love, a stubborn and fierce thing, endured. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.